designers, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you 9 ways to put bone in bustiers or corsets. Let's get into this. Alright designers, let's get started. But first I want to tell you about a little wild animal that I have. She is so cute, but she doesn't like when I give her a lot of love. And when she gets mad, this is what happens. She will scratch my hands. I still love her though. She's just a baby. Anyway, we're going to start with the basic boning methods, then the rigilene methods. So let's get started with the basics. This foot I use a lot, and it's called the edge foot. It's also called a stitch in the ditch foot. I use it a lot because it makes my line straight when I'm dealing with boning. The first method is plastic boning. This boning is 1/4, and the stitch in the ditch foot is 1/4 too. So from here to here is 1/4. When you're sewing the casing, you have to move the needle like this. You move it once. You don't move it too far, because if you do that, then the casing will be big and your boning is going to be turning around and around inside the casing, and you don't want that. That would be very annoying for the client. But don't sew it too close, because then the boning won't go in. It will be too tight. Let's sew this. This is how it's going to look. You put the boning in, it's nice and smooth. It's not big, it's not tight, it's perfect. You can put the design like this underneath the bust, or let's say you don't want it in the main fabric and you want it in the lining. This is what it's going to look like. The main fabric will be plain and you have the boning in the lining. Now let's get into method 2. Method 2 is similar to method 1. The only difference is that both sides are going to have casing. Right here, these sides right here are going to be sewn down, and we're going to make casing for each one of them. Let's sew it down. This is how it looks on one side. Now we're going to turn it around and sew the other side. This is what I do to my boning. I just burn it. Some people use sandpaper and some people use scissors to cut the corners. I just burn it. Let's put the boning in on both sides, and this is what it looks like. You have the boning on both sides. You can also put this on bustiers, and it looks like this. Okay, this is really nice. Now let's get into method 3. Method 3 is basically putting bias tape on the front of your fabric, not inside the fabric. So you're going to put it here like this. You're going to sew it on both sides at the edge. I use my regular foot for this. Also, make sure that the binding is in the middle of the seam allowance. Let's sew this down. This is how it looks on one side. Let's turn it to the other side. And voila, this is how it looks. This is the back and this is the front. I like this one because it gives it a little more style. You know what I mean? Anyway, let's get into method 4. This time we're going to take the binding and sew it to the seam allowance only, not to the fabric. So we're going to put it in the middle, and it's not going to show here. So it's going to be invisible. I want to show you guys something. This part right here is the serger, and it helps me a whole lot. The serger, if you measure it, it's 1/4. So if it's 1/4 on one side, then it's 1/4 on the other side. That means the middle is a half. It helps to keep your lines straight. If you ever wonder why my lines are so neat, this is one of the reasons why. Let's sew the binding to both sides of the seam allowance only. This is how it looks on one side. Then we're going to turn it around and do it again on the other side. Sew it to the seam allowance only. This is how it looks, guys. How do you like the video so far? If you like it, smash that like button. All right, let's get back to this. You can also put the boning in the lining. Let's say you want your main fabric to be plain. You can also put it in the lining. Let's get into method 5. This fabric is mesh, and people use it for corsets and bustiers. There's different ways to sew this. I'm only going to show you one way today. We're going to sew the seam allowance to the right side of the fabric, not the wrong side like we usually do. Once we sew it to the right side of the fabric, we're going to cut it down 1/4. My seam allowance is a 1/2 inch. I'm going to cut it down to 1/4. Once you do that, you're going to take the binding and you're going to put it in the middle of the seam allowance. Then you're going to sew it down on the edges. Make sure that the binding is in the middle. You do not want it crooked because it's going to show in the front of your fabric. Let's sew this. This is one side, turn it over. And this is the other side. This is the back, so it's clean. You're not going to see the raw edges. There are different types of bias tape. You have the pre-made ones that's in the package. You have the ones that you use for the wires. And also you have the ones that you make yourself with any fabric you want. This is how the back looks, nice and neat. Bias tape doesn't have to be sewn to seam allowance. You can sew it anywhere you want. Here is an example. This is how it looks. It doesn't matter where you put it. It's all up to how you want your designs. Next, we're going to do method 6. Let's take the binding and put it on the seam allowance. When we sew it, it's going to show in the front. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to put some pins. This is more like a 2-step. Not too many people use this method, but I do see some YouTubers using it, so I thought that I'll just show you anyway. I don't really use this method, but anyway, let's move on. So we're going to put the pins on this side. This is the reason why I like when I serge fabric, because it keeps everything neat. It also keeps me in line. So if I go over the serger is going to let me know, no, stay in line. You know what I mean? That's why I like it. This method is more of a 2-step if you are using the bias tape. Once you put the pins in the back, the next step is to take the pins and put them in the front. What's going to happen is you're going to sew it from the front. You're not going to sew it in the back. Some people sew it in the back and wonder why the lines in the front is crooked. This is one good way to make sure the lines in the front of your fabric is straight. I'm going to show you another way in a second, but let's do this one first. I usually change my foot for this. Let's go back to the stitch and the ditch foot. We're not going to use this corner. We're going to use this one right here. Remember, the boning is 1/4, so the casing has to be divided by 2, which will be 1/8. But you don't want it so close to the boning because the boning won't be able to get inside the casing. Next, we're going to put the needle position all the way at the end and sew. Once you do that, you turn it around just to see if it got caught. And as you can see, it was real close. There's another method I'm going to show you after this, instead of using this casing right here, so you don't have to go through these issues. Now we're going to turn this around and we're going to sew the other side. And this is how it looks. You probably wouldn't want to do this method because of the 2 steps, but I'm going to show you another way to do the casing, and I know that's going to change your mind. You can actually do this on a bustier too. This is how it looks. It's really nice. I like it. It's a different look, you know. So here is the other way for the casing. Some people don't want to worry about, did you sew it right? I mean, you know, who got time for that? So this is what you do. You take a piece of fabric, fold it to the length that you need, and sew it on the front like before. And you will have a casing that you don't have to worry about. Okay? It's that simple. You just sew it to the front. Now let's get into method 1 for rigilene boning. In this situation, you're going to put the seam allowance together and sew the boning at the corner of the seam allowance. You can put either fabric or tape for the ends. So you're going to put the boning right at the corner like this and sew at the edge of the boning. Make sure you don't go over that line. You could put fabric or tape, whichever one. Once you do that, you're going to open up the fabric and you're going to sew it. Turn it around and sew it down. But first you have to figure out how much space you want. Remember, this boning is a 1/2 inch, so you don't want to go over that. You could sew it about 3/8 from the edge where that line is. See, it's a 1/2 inch boning. 3/8 look good to me. This is what it looks like when you turn it around. You won't see the boning. It's inside the seam allowance. However, with this method, you won't be able to use it for the center front. Here is why. You will have a problem when sewing the cups. There won't be no space to close the cups. It could be used for under the bust, but for the center front, 1 boning is suggested. It would be better for the center front of a bustier, as you can see. Let's move on to method 2. This time I'm going to change to my regular foot. And we're going to move the needle back to the middle. Like that. Next, you're going to take the boning and put it on the seam allowance. Sew the boning to the seam allowance only. Like this. Then you're going to turn it around and sew it to the other seam allowance. This is how it looks. It's going to be invisible in the front of your fabric because it's sewn just to the seam allowance. Next is method 3, and honestly, it's like method 6 for the plastic boning. So instead of the casing for the plastic, it's just sewing the rigilene. So we're going to put it on the seam allowance like this. Some people just sew it like this, but then their lines in the front is crooked. So I'm going to show you a different way to make sure that your lines are straight. We're going to put pins on the fabric. And let me show you what that looks like. Let's make sure the boning is in the middle. Before you put the pin in, you're going to feel the corner of the boning. Then from there, go in and out of each corner. This will lock the boning down, and you will know for a fact it's not going anywhere. Doing it this way will make your stitch lines straight in the front and the boning straight in the back. Before we sew this, we're going to change the foot back to the stitch in the ditch foot, and we're going to sew it here. The line is going to be right there. This is one side. Let's do the other side. Look how it looks. No crooked lines. Everything is nice and straight. And yes, I saved the best for last. I'm glad you stayed with me. I have some important information for you. All this right here is plastic boning. This is rigilene, and this is rigilene. This is plastic boning. If the princess line curves is a C cup or higher, you cannot use rigilene. You can only use it for straight lines, like the center front. This is like a straight line, so you could use it here. However, over here is the bust cup. So if it's a C cup or bigger, you cannot use it. The only reason why it's on this bustier is because it's a B cup. Once it gets to a C or higher, it won't be able to sew on the curve. And neither does the white steel bone. That's why it's not good to use that one either. For style, this is one boning and this is two boning. My favorite is two boning. It looks a little more stylish to me. One boning is okay, but if I had to choose, I like the two boning. What about you? What's your favorite? Also, let me know in the comments which method you never used before. Now you know there are different methods to make corsets and bustiers. Alright designers, if you want to learn more about invisible zippers, here is a video and I will see you in the next one. Don't forget to practice, practice, practice. Bye designers.